George E. Allen was born on a leap day, February 29, 1896, to Sam and Molly Allen in Booneville, Mississippi. This child with a unique birthday would grow up to have a big impact on our country and the world. His father, Sam, was a lawyer and brother of John Allen, U.S. Representative for 8 terms from 1885 till 1901. Unfortunately, George's father died when he was 7 years old. His mother, Molly, played the piano at the Methodist Church and taught 50 in the men's Sunday school class. His youth in Booneville was spent playing ball, fishing, and studying, probably in that order. When he was 16 years old, the local delegate to the National Democratic Convention in Baltimore couldn't attend, but appointed George as his alternate. George said, "I marched and shouted for Oscar Underwood, who lost the presidential nomination to Woodrow Wilson." To his boyhood mind, the victory of a school teacher was an unbearable insult. Although exhausted, George wanted to visit New York City, so he took the train north, checked into the Bresden Hotel for a brief nap, and awoke 21 hours later, just in time to catch the train back to Mississippi.
My family was really all right. I never worried about where my next meal was coming from. And my father was a successful small-town lawyer. And my mother inherited some money from her father when he died. And very good. She was a smart businesswoman, too. When my father died, she managed the estate of what he had. And we lived all right. There never were any problems about finances. Not rich at all, but very, very comfortable. And we didn't know many rich people. There weren't very many rich people in Booneville.
Leaving Booneville to further his education, he attended several colleges, finally settling at Cumberland University in Tennessee to study law. George had played semi-pro baseball and was a student manager for the Cumberland baseball team. Somehow, a football game was scheduled with Georgia Tech in Atlanta, coached by John Heisman of the Heisman Trophy fame. Cumberland had defeated Tech in baseball the previous year 22-0, and Tech was itching for payback. George assembled a team of volunteers who, in our secret practices, looked pretty hot to me, and went to Atlanta with high hopes for an upset. Unfortunately for Cumberland, what ensued was the most lopsided score in the history of college football, 222-0. And the second half was cut short by 15 minutes. After receiving his law degree, George opened an office in Okolona to be near his Uncle John in Tupelo. Shortly thereafter, World War I started in Europe, and George enlisted, where he fought the good fight in triplicate at Fort Beauregard in Louisiana, and was then sent to France, where he never heard a gun fired in anger. After the war ended, George moved to Indiana, bouncing between jobs until landing at the Congress Hotel in Chicago. He began buying hotels on margin and was a millionaire by the age of 34. Then the Great Depression hit, and he found himself broke with over $500,000 of debt. Rather than file bankruptcy, he continued to chip away at what he owed, finally paying it all back after World War II. Since his greatest gift was talking, he decided to live in Washington, D.C., where the primary industry was talking. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected the 32nd president in 1933. Allen was appointed relief administrator for the District of Columbia by FDR's administration. George was convinced that unemployed Americans preferred a job to relief payments. With that theory in mind, George spent several weeks in tattered clothes, standing in soup lines and job lines across the industrial heartland, applying for work. He came back to Washington and outlined a jobs program to President Roosevelt that became the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. When FDR announced the $4.8 trillion WPA program in 1935, he told the reporters that it was developed from a recommendation by George E. Allen. Two local WPA buildings in Booneville are the old high school and former post office, now Chancery Court building. Almost 3.5 million people were employed nationwide by the WPA to build schools, hospitals, airports, and highways. The WPA helped pull our nation out of the Great Depression. One of the greatest health threats facing the world was infantile paralysis, or polio. FDR contracted polio himself in 1921 at the age of 39 and served 12 years as president, paralyzed from the waist down in a wheelchair. One day, his advisors, including George, were brainstorming ideas to increase funding for polio research and treatment. They came up with the idea to have school children mail dimes to the White House. Allen allegedly said that maybe they would get a trickle of dimes in the mail, but when entertainer Eddie Cantor and the Lone Ranger put out an appeal on their radio programs, the trickle of dimes turned into a flood. 2,680,000 dimes arrived from the initial appeal, and by 1950, over $30 million was raised annually by the March of Dimes. These dimes funded the research of Drs. Salk and Sabin that resulted in vaccines eliminating new polio cases in the United States and most of the world. George E. Allen was the first executive director of the National March of Dimes and proudly served as a director of the organization for decades. In 1946, the dime design was changed with FDR's image replacing Lady Liberty because of the success and the successful efforts to involve school children in eliminating polio. His friendship with President Harry Truman started when Truman was a senator from Missouri. It continued when Truman became vice president and grew when Truman became president following FDR's death. He became Truman's closest advisor, speechwriter, and wrote a manual to liquidate various war agencies at the end of World War II. George E. Allen was a member of the Advisory Committee for the American Red Cross. On a visit to Ireland and England during World War II for the Red Cross, he became friends with Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. George was pictured on the cover of Time magazine in 1946 with the caption, "For the Presidents, Jokes and Chores." Each time he went to Europe during and after the war, he and General Eisenhower became better friends. Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Eisenhower had been close friends for many years. The Allens had a farm in Gettysburg, and following 2 terms as president, the Eisenhowers bought a farm nearby to live close to the Allens. In a radio interview, Allen said that he and former President Eisenhower were planning a road trip to Booneville for just the 2 of them, but unfortunately Eisenhower passed before they could go.
Buy stuff. He was quite a fellow. We were just fixing to make a trip when he had his last heart attack. We were going to get in a car. We were going down to Mississippi, by the way. He wanted to go to Booneville, my hometown, and see what I'd told him about over the years. And we were just going to take a Secret Service car with us, nobody else. Going to stop at motels, and he wanted to get back. See, he was a small Kansas boy.
At one time, George E. Allen served on the board of directors of 35 important U.S. corporations, more than any other individual. He wrote a book, Presidents Who Have Known Me, in 1950, with an updated version in 1960. He died in 1973 in Palm Desert, California. His longtime assistant during his government service, Samuel McIlwain, delivered the eulogy at his funeral in Booneville. George E. Allen made a profound impact on this nation, using his wit and humor to get the attention of people in high places. Then, with his keen intellect, his fundamental common sense, and his good judgment, He furnished wise counsel not only to those in high places in government, but also to many of the leaders in industry. According to his final wishes, he left $200,000 to build this George E. Allen Library for our community and to house the artifacts of his outstanding life of service. He also requested to be buried beside his parents, Sam and Molly, in the Booneville Cemetery.